Hey guys, it's Miss Winky, and we are going to wrap up notes for week 1 of Unit 5. And today, what we're talking about is compromises and acts, basically, like the political, economic, and I guess in some ways, social causes of the Civil War. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so take a look at this graphic because this graphic is actually really important. Where's my pointer? I haven't used that in a while. Ooh, okay. So all of these states down here were considered to be part of the South. Okay. So all these states down here in orange were considered to be part of the South. Then in the North, you're kind of divided a little bit. You've got the Northeast here, which is in green. And then you've got the Midwest states up here. Okay. And you can see that within each of these regions, you're divided up into smaller regions. Like, for example, you've got the New England states and the Middle Atlantic states. And then over here, you've got the South Atlantic, the East, South Central, and the Southwest Central over here. So everything's kind of divided up into little subgroups. But you can see the three big divisions are the South, the Northeast, and the Midwest. Okay. So each region of the United States by this point has begun to develop in distinctly different ways. And you guys know from the beginning of the year when we talked about regions that they have lots of things in common. You know, the states that are together in a region have things that are in common, and those are things that generally make them different from states that aren't in their region. So we're talking differences here between climates, between geography in terms of like their physical geography, between their economies, between their culture, and even in their populations. Okay. And these differences begin to create tensions between the regions. And one of the big issues that they had was it ends up in the issue of states' rights. But basically, it was the feeling that the national government was not making laws that were fair to all the states, which, you know, to be fair, that'd be really difficult to do when the states are that different. How on earth are you going to make a law that's best for everybody when they're all that different? But you know, that begins to cause conflict when there's laws that everybody is expected to follow, but they seem to favor one region over the other, and that starts to create tension between the regions. And so this also begins to divide the people of the United States, where they start feeling more loyal to their region of the United States than they do to their country. All right, so let's talk about how these regions were different. So the southern region, all these orange states down here, they depended on agriculture. Their economies were primarily dependent on agriculture, the production of agricultural products. For the most part, the things that they produced were rice, cotton, and tobacco. Those were the big cash crops that were coming out of the southern states. And these crops, like we've said in part A, they required a lot of workers. They required a lot of workers. You needed a lot of land to be able to plant enough of it to make money. And you needed a lot of workers to plant, to tend to, and to harvest those crops. Now, another interesting factor here is that the southern states had smaller populations. So when you think about it, you got to buy a whole lot of land, right? You got to own a whole lot of land in order to be able to farm and really make a profit. And when you own a whole lot of land, that means your neighbors are not going to be really close, right? In terms of location, they're not going to be super close to you because you own a lot of land. You know, if you own 2,000 acres and your house is right in the middle of it, you don't have any neighbors. They're going to be all, you know, 1,000 or so acres away. So the southern states, the people of the southern states were really spread out. The population was a lot more rural. You did have some big cities, but not many. And you would have a larger population there. But for the most part, people were all spread out and their populations were much smaller. So that creates a problem here because these crops required a whole lot of workers, and the southern states had small populations. They didn't have enough people to do the work. So they started bringing workers in. And when I say workers, I mean slaves. They began bringing slaves in to do that work. Okay. Does that excuse the fact that they turned to slavery? No, it does not. It just gives you an idea of why they felt like it was necessary. So, this region of the United States becomes dependent on slave labor because the more land they buy and the more crops they plant, the more workers they need. There were not enough workers available. And so, to meet the need for workers, they began purchasing slaves and they become dependent on slave labor in order to continue to produce crops at the level at which they were used to producing them. Okay, now look at the upper Midwest. Okay, so here's the thing about the upper Midwest. They were also very much an agricultural economy, but they don't end up becoming dependent on slave labor. In fact, like only like one, maybe two of those states were even slave owning states where slavery was allowed. So, what made them different? They also depended on agriculture. They also needed workers to plant their crops. Why didn't they need slave labor? Well, the crops that they grew were mainly wheat and grains. They become known as like the bread basket of the United States because that's what they're growing there. And they had specialized machinery. You might have learned about the mechanical reaper in one of your other social studies classes, maybe like fifth grade in elementary school. But the mechanical reaper and other specialized machinery had been invented. And that meant they didn't need as many workers. They didn't need a whole lot of workers to harvest their crops because they had specialized machinery that did it for them. So they didn't need as many workers as the South did. And so slavery decreased in this area and eventually dies out because they just didn't need the additional help. All right, now let's talk about the Northeast. And you guys already know the Northeast, the majority, if not all of these states, had already completely outlawed slavery before any of this even becomes an issue. So, what was their economy dependent on? Industry and trade. Industry and trade were the big money makers for the northeastern states. Okay, they had textile mills and they had manufacturing. So the industrial revolution had definitely happened here. And they had factories where they were producing manufactured goods, whereas the southern states did not. We were still making all the raw materials, but we didn't have the industry. We didn't have the manufacturing to do anything with those raw materials. Now, another interesting fact about the northeastern states or the northern states is they had larger populations. In fact, most of those states had the largest populations in the United States. And the reason for that was because of immigration. See, this is that time period when immigrants are just coming wave upon wave upon wave to the United States. And typically, they came in right over here in New York to Ellis Island. So a lot of those immigrants would come in to New York via Ellis Island, and then they would end up staying in New York or in New Jersey or in Pennsylvania. And they didn't go all the way down south. And people down south weren't going to be able to pay them what they wanted to be paid. And they wanted to work factory jobs and other things like that. So the immigrants end up staying in those northeastern states mainly because that's where the boat dropped them off. And so the northern states put immigrants to work in their mills and factories. Okay. They had a larger population, and the reason they had a larger population was due to immigrants. And so they put immigrants to work in their factories. So here's something interesting, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it because it's not in our standards. But one thing that I find really interesting is that immigrants were treated like crap. They were treated terribly when they first came to the United States. People knew that they were desperate, that they'd come over with the clothes on their back and whatever they had. They needed work. A lot of them were working to try to send money back home to bring family members to the United States. And so a lot of these factories and mills took advantage of that desperation and paid them, barely even a living wage. And it put them in situations where they could not quit their jobs. So, in many ways, immigrants were treated, even though they were technically free, immigrants were treated a lot like slaves were. And of course, it's not the same concept. Immigrants weren't bought and paid for and sold and considered to be property. So you can't really, it's apples to oranges. But they both had seeds. They both had seeds, and they definitely had some things that were similar between the treatment of the two groups. And urban areas were where most of the population was located in those northeastern states. So wherever the big cities were, that's where the people lived, which of course was the total opposite of the South, where everybody lived in these rural areas and was all spread out. In the northeastern states, people were clustered together around the large cities, living in those urban areas. So the South was very rural, the North was much more urban. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, states' rights becomes a big issue. In addition to slavery and economics, states' rights becomes a big dividing issue between the North and the South. And they start debating over how much power the federal government ought to have, because the Southerners, especially, felt that the national government was intruding more and more on their rights, that the national government was regulating and making laws about things that they hadn't in the past. And this was intruding on the rights of the states to do the things that they thought were best for their state. So here's the definition that we're working with for this unit for states' rights. It's kind of wordy, sorry. The belief that all powers not specifically given to the national government in the United States Constitution or specifically denied to the states in the United States Constitution, that those powers should remain with the states. So basically, if it doesn't say in the US Constitution that this power is only for the national government, and it doesn't say in the US Constitution that the states cannot have this power, then all of those powers should remain with the states. That was the belief of states' rights. And really, just fundamentally, the Southern states felt like the states should have the final authority, that the national government should not have the final authority, that the final decision as to whether or not to follow a law should be with the states. All right. So let's get to the Balancing Act, because the Balancing Act is a big deal in Unit 5. So by the time we hit the early 1800s, there is a balance in the United States between the number of free states and the number of slave states. There were actually 11 of each. And every time the United States acquired new land, that land would start, people would start organizing the land into territories. And when they were ready, they would petition or request to become part of the United States, to become a state in the United States. So during this time period, there'd been a huge purchase. Perhaps you've heard of it, the Louisiana Purchase, where we bought a whole lot of land along like the Mississippi and the Ohio River Valley and all that stuff. Bought it from France because Napoleon needed money, and we bought it for like nothing. Like we got it dirt cheap. So all that land becomes part of the United States, and of course, it begins organizing and turning into territories, and then those territories start asking to become states. And every time one of them does that, the question arises as to whether this is going to be a free state or whether this is going to be a slave state. And keeping the balance between the two becomes a big, big deal. And the reason for that is because each side is worried that the other is going to gain control of Congress and basically be able to pass any laws that they want to if they had the majority in both the House and the Senate. The concern was that they would be able to pass any laws that they wanted in Congress. So that was the concern. So along comes Missouri. Missouri was part of that territory that had been gained through the Louisiana Purchase. They wanted to join the United States, and they wanted to join as a slave state. They wanted slavery to be legal. Well, the northern states were against this. They wanted to let Missouri join, but only if slavery was going to be illegal there. So Congress has to try to find a way to keep the balance. Like, what are you going to do? Now you're going to have 12 slave states and 11 free states. How are you going to work this out? So what they come up with is called the Missouri Compromise. And by the way, keep an eye out in this presentation for things that are labeled in with a red heading, because that means there's a video in there somewhere. So be sure that you click on that and watch this quick little video about the Missouri Compromise. I actually found a series called, what was it called? So Sound Smart. Sound Smart is what it's called. It's from the History Channel. And they tell you like just enough about a historical topic so that you can talk about it and sound like you're smart when you really don't know like all the details, but you know just enough to be able to talk about it and get away with it. So the Missouri Compromise comes around in 1820. And here's what they ended up doing. They decided that Missouri would be able to join as a slave state. And the only reason Missouri was able to do that was because Maine was also going to request to join the Union at the same time. And I know that seems weird because it seems like Maine had always been there. Maine had actually been part of New Hampshire up until this point, and it broke off from or broke away from New Hampshire to form its own state. So we've got 12 free states and 12 slave states, and the balance is maintained. And what they did to try to keep this from becoming a problem when any future states were added to the United States is they decided to use Missouri's southern border as the dividing line. And any new states that came in north of that line, except for Missouri, obviously, but any new states that came in north of that line would be free states. And any new states that came in below that line would be slave states. And of course, you know, since the territory we're talking about is Louisiana Purchase and all of that Western territory, none of that belonged to us yet. So it makes a little more sense when you see the map. And hang on, I'll show you the map in just a second. And this compromise works for a while. It sticks around for about 30 years, and then we have to come up with a new one in 1850. And don't worry, hold tight. I'll be telling you about that one too. So here's a map that kind of shows you what the Missouri Compromise result was. So you've got all these red states over here. Those are the slave states. And then up here, you've got all the blue states and territories that were free states and territories. And then look over here, this is all still Spanish territory. Okay. So, like, sorry, there's like no Texas. There's like, no, what are they? What even are those other states? Whatever. All of them are still Spanish. So we don't care. They're not states yet. And then you've got all of this territory here that is unorganized. See, because all of this was part of the Louisiana Purchase. Okay. So Louisiana had joined the Union. They were going to be a slave state. Missouri had just joined the Union. They were going to be a slave state. And look, you got Arkansas. They're still territory down here, and they're opened for slavery. In other words, they can have slavery in this territory as a result of the Missouri Compromise. And then here's the line right here that goes along Missouri's southern border. So everything that joined from to the north, that was all supposed to become free. Okay. And just remember, none of this is completely ours yet. Like Oregon, we were still kind of like sharing with Great Britain, whatever. And then this all still belonged to Spain and then later to Mexico. So all we're talking about is this territory right here that still remains. And that line is supposed to solve the problem. And we don't have to worry about whether to doing any new compromises or anything like that for slave states or free states. Yay. Way to go, Missouri Compromise. And look, here's Maine up here. See? Brand new Maine. All right. So now let's talk about the tariff of 1828 because, you know, like in terms of time, sequentially speaking, that's what comes up next. So a tariff is a tax. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. And in 1828, the Congress passed a tariff or a tax on foreign imports that was intended to encourage Americans to buy American made products. See, that sounds like a good thing, right? Like, who wouldn't want to get behind that? We want Americans to buy American made products. That's good for American business. Go team. God bless the USA, right? Except we got sectionalism happening here. We got division between these regions. Okay. Now, the North, they liked high tariffs. They were cool with that. And the reason that they were okay with that is because most industries were located in the North. So, this whole buying American made products, that was going to benefit them because the American made products were being made in Northern industries. So, they knew that that was going to be good for their businesses and it would make their goods cheaper than imported goods because anything that you bought from another country, any foreign goods that you bought would have a tax added to them and it would make them more expensive. Okay. So the North, they were totally on board for high tariffs because industries were located in the North and they knew that this would be good for their businesses because it made their goods cheaper, which meant Americans would buy them. Okay. I'll give you 50 cents. If you can tell me who was against tariffs. Come on, you didn't think I was going to say dollars. Come on, seriously. Yeah, the South. They were totally against tariffs. Okay, now think about it. What did I tell you earlier about the South? What did the North have that the South did not have? Yeah, industries. The South didn't have any industry. They imported most of their goods. So that meant if they wanted to keep buying those goods that they were importing from other countries, they were going to have to pay the tariff. Well, so now you're probably thinking to yourself, well, self, why don't they just buy American made products? Why don't they just stop buying the imports? Well, that's an excellent question, which is why I added it right here because it's actually a really good question. And it was because they were afraid that if they stopped buying these imported goods, that foreign countries would stop buying their cotton. Like Great Britain, for example, who remember was getting 75% of their cotton from the American South. The South was afraid to stop buying the imports because if they did, they were afraid that foreign countries like Great Britain would get mad and try to get even with them and stop buying their cotton. So that's why they hated them. And you can see the way this breaks down that all of these states were against the tariff of 1828. Okay. And look, these are the states where most of the industry was located right here. Okay. They were for it. So were some of these other green states. Look, Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri. What? You guys are supposed to be southern states. They were for the tariff. And then up here, the blue states, some of them were for it, some of them were against. But it's really obvious to see that the South, or what the majority of what we think of as the southern states, were totally against that tariff of 1828. Okay, so what are they going to do about it? It's federal law. Well, here's what they're going to do about it. This guy, John C. Calhoun, who actually was like vice president of the United States, he ends up resigning his job. He was from South Carolina, and he ends up quitting his job and coming home to fight the tariff of 1828. Okay. I know he looks like a deranged Muppet. Try not to look at his very, very scary, intense eyes. So he comes home to fight the tariff. And if you click on him, by the way, there's a video where this is referred to as the tariff of abomination. So South Carolina threatens to nullify the federal tax, and nullification means to refuse to follow it, to not follow national laws within a state. Okay. Now, we've already talked about nullification once this year. Do you remember uh, when we talked about the Supreme Court decision, the Worcester v. Georgia decision, and that the Supreme Court said, yep, that's unconstitutional. You need to let those missionaries go. And the President of the United States refused to enforce it. That's also an example of nullification. Hey, fun fact, guess who John C. Calhoun was vice president for? Andrew Jackson. And guess who's going to go try to force South Carolina to follow this law? Andrew Jackson. Irony of ironies. So, meanwhile, in Georgia, because remember, this is Georgia studies, not South Carolina studies, Georgia's legislature was talking about this tariff, and we were definitely against it, but we weren't going to go so far as to not follow it. Like, we weren't ready to, like, basically have troops brought in to force us to follow this law. So we didn't go as far as to nullify the tariff of 1828. But John C. Calhoun did, and Andrew Jackson threatens to send troops in, basically sends the U.S. Army in to force them to follow it, and says that if he sees John C. Calhoun, he's going to, quote, hang him from the nearest tree. So threatens to send in troops and threatens to, execute his former vice president. And South Carolina is like, no, it's fine. We're good. We'll follow the tariff. They back down. But all of these issues boost that states' rights argument between the North and the South, where the South felt like the states really should have the final say as to whether they followed federal law, especially if those laws did not benefit them. And this is, again, an example of the deep divisions between different regions in the United States. So, what do you think? Should a state have the right to nullify a federal law if it's harmful to that state? Should states be able to do that? Can you think of any modern examples of that where states have fought back against following a federal law? Is that something that states should have the right to do, or should everybody follow federal law? Interesting thoughts, isn't it? All right, so we got more land. See all this land over here? Like we already had like this part of the Republic of Texas, but we end up getting all of this land. Okay, so part of it was given up in the Mexican Cession. Like basically, we had fought in the Mexican American War, and when the war was over, Mexico ceded or gave up that land to us. And then we bought this little piece down here that was called the Gadsden Purchase that we bought in 1853 to kind of, finish that little section up. And then, here's the modern day shape of Texas. And then right here, you've got all this gray area. And this was basically like disputed territory. Texas said that it belonged to them and were like, trying to get the Supreme Court and everybody to like say that it was okay for them to annex or take over that land. And then it's going to end up becoming part of the next compromise. So just kind of hold that thought. So now we got all this new territory. That territory is going to start organizing itself into states. And this is new territory that whole Missouri Compromise line isn't really going to help with. It's going to, it's not going to solve all of these issues. So arguments over slavery start again. And one of the big questions that people had was, wait a minute, how come Congress gets to decide if a territory is going to be slave or free? How can they just draw an arbitrary line like the Missouri Compromise line and decide whether or not states get to be free states or slave states in advance? Why can't the people decide for themselves? So this new concept is brought up, and it was called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty, and the definition we're going to work with for this unit for popular sovereignty is that people living in a new territory should have the right to decide important issues for themselves, such as whether or not to allow slavery. Okay, so basically, people would get to vote. People living in a new territory would get to vote as to whether they wanted their territory and later their state to become a free or slave state. Okay, so enter New Mexico and Utah. Okay, so we've got two new territories that have been created. Then we've also got California out here, and they're going through the gold rush. And so they end up requesting to join the United States as a new state, kind of with for some help with the gold rush. And so again, now we've got some issues with the balance of power because we're all balanced out with free states and slave states. And now you've got these new territories and the state of California that are requested to join the union. And are they going to be slave states or are they going to be free states? So we had to come up with a new compromise, and this was referred to as the Compromise of 1850. And it wasn't just one document, it was actually like 5 separate laws that together made up the package for the Compromise of 1850. And if you click on the title, there's a quick video about it. So basically, the goal of the Compromise of 1850, just like the goal of the Missouri Compromise, was to keep the states together, try to keep the Union together. So what they ended up deciding, and again, this was in five separate acts. California would be a free state. Texas was already open to slavery, so that would be a slave state. So that was going to even out free and slave. And then they decided that these new territories would get to vote free or slave as they joined the United States. And so this is obviously going to apply to New Mexico and Utah. They also, as part of the Compromise of 1850, abolished the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Now, they didn't get rid of it completely. People that owned slaves would get to keep their slaves, but there would no longer be buying or selling of slaves in Washington, D.C. And the thought was that, this was the nation's capital and that it needed to remain neutral and not have a really busy, big, active slave market, which they did up until that point. And then the last thing that was added was the Fugitive Slave Act. And this was basically added to like pacify the southern states, because the southern states were all mad because they didn't feel like this compromise package really benefited them in the manner that they'd hoped. So they added a Fugitive Slave Act to it. And the Fugitive Slave Act basically said that all escaped slaves, any slaves who had escaped to the North, had to legally be returned to their owners. And you might remember from going through Notes 1, Part A about slavery, it mentioned the Fugitive Slave Act a couple of times and how that was one of the things that motivated Harriet Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. The fact that now all slaves who had escaped to the North to be free would have to legally be returned to their owners. All right, so here's a map, and it shows you what the Compromise of 1850 did for the United States. Okay, so we got all these states up here in blue that are free states. Okay, these are states, not territories, and they're free. Okay, and then down here in red, you've got all of these states that are slave. Okay, now because of the Missouri Compromise, you've still got territory right here that is open to slavery, meaning they're allowed to have slaves there because of the Missouri Compromise. Okay. But then look at the key here. See where you've got the little, like the little tic tac toe board of a crosshatch? That's also territory that's been open to slavery. And that was as a result of the Compromise of 1850. So you've got Utah Territory and New Mexico Territory. And they were technically opened to slavery as a result of the Compromise of 1850, meaning that it was possible that they could have slavery. They were going to get to vote eventually. So it was possible that they would get to have slavery. And then you've got California as the newest free state here. And then again, Texas is going to remain a slave state. And then, based on the Missouri Compromise line, all of this remaining territory should be closed to slavery. Okay. So that map shows you how things kind of worked out on the map for the Compromise of 1850. Okay, so in order for all of those laws that made up the package for the Compromise of 1850, in order for them to pass, some of the southern states were going to have to vote yes. Like there was no way that it would pass if only the free states voted for it and the slave states didn't. If only the North voted for it and the South did not, there's no way that compromise would pass. So the Compromise of 1850 kind of turns into a big argument because the slave states still kind of felt like they were being ripped off. So Georgia holds a convention, like they get their legislature together to debate or argue and talk about the Compromise of 1850 because they had to vote on whether or not to ratify it so that all of those parts of the package would become law. So these are the things that they discussed at that convention or that meeting of the legislature. They talked about how to protect slavery, because by this point, you had slave owners that had a huge amount of money invested in their slaves. Like they'd spent a lot of money on their slaves and they did not want slavery to become illegal. They knew that the South's agricultural economy could not function without slave labor. So they're discussing how to protect that practice. And they also talked about possibly seceding or withdrawing from the Union. So this was something that they were discussing in 1850. What they decided to do, that final decision was referred to as the Georgia platform. Okay. So a platform is something that you stand on. Okay. It's like something that you stand on. And so this was where Georgia stood in terms of the Compromise of 1850. And this is what they told Congress. They said, we will accept the Compromise of 1850, but we're going to resist if the North tries to stop or hinder slavery in any way. And by resist, they mean like secede and fight back. And we're going to resist if the North doesn't uphold the Fugitive Slave Act. Like you can't say it's law and then refuse to enforce it. You have to uphold the Fugitive Slave Act or we are going to resist. That means secede and fight back. So the Georgia platform was what the other Southern states ended up following as well. The other Southern states were also debating whether or not to ratify the Compromise of 1850. And so they ended up following the Georgia Platform as well. And the Georgia Platform is basically credited with saving the Union in 1850, because if this had not been something that Georgia and the other Southern states could agree upon, then it's absolutely possible that secession and the war would have started in 1850 instead of starting in the 1860s. All right, so 4 years later, we got another compromise or another act that we have to work our way through. Okay, so click here and watch the really quick video about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas and Nebraska were about to join the United States as territories, and Congress passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which gave the people of Kansas and Nebraska the ability to vote as to whether they wanted to have slavery or whether they didn't. So it gave them popular sovereignty. Okay. And basically, this repeals or nullifies the Missouri Compromise because, as you might remember, here, let me go back and show you the map in case you don't. Um, Here's the Missouri Compromise line. Okay. And of course, Kansas and Nebraska are up here in that unorganized territory that's supposed to be closed to slavery because of the Missouri Compromise. Okay. So the Kansas Nebraska Act basically repeals or nullifies the Missouri Compromise because they were both north of line. So here's what Kansas Nebraska does. Here's how this changes, okay? Because remember, everything up here was closed to slavery, right? So now Kansas and Nebraska are technically open to slavery. It's up to them as to what they vote and decide to do. Okay, so Kansas, Nebraska gives them popular sovereignty and gives them the ability to vote and decide whether they want to be free or slave. And, not content to let the people of Kansas and Nebraska decide on their own, pro slavery start moving to Kansas. Pro slavery people that were like for slavery, they started moving to Kansas to try to sway the vote. Like they went to go move and live there so that they could vote for slavery. And of course, abolitionists or people who were against slavery, they did the same thing. They started moving out there to try to influence the vote, to vote for it to be a free state. And violence between these two groups, because as I'm sure you can imagine, people who were for slavery and people who were against slavery were not a whole lot of fun to have together at a dinner party because, they were pretty passionate about their opinions. So violence breaks out in Kansas, and Kansas gets nicknamed Bleeding Kansas because of these violent confrontations that were going on there over, whether they should be a slave state or a free state. So Kansas finally votes, and they end up deciding to become a free state. And the southern states felt like the vote was unfair. They felt like the vote had been swayed by abolitionists, and that the vote itself was not fair. All right, so the next big event that's going to kind of weigh heavily on the approaching war is the Dred Scott decision. And if you click here, you can watch a quick video about the Dred Scott case. So this happens in 1857. And long story short, Dred Scott was a slave and he moved with his owner to a free state. And so later, he and his wife sued, like they took this to court and argued that because they lived in a free state, that they were now free, that slavery was illegal in that state, so that since they lived there, they should now be free. So this ends up going before the US Supreme Court. And I know you probably have like high hopes about this because remember in Unit 4, the whole Worcester v. Georgia case goes before the Supreme Court. And at the time, you were probably thinking, oh, they're probably going to decide against the Cherokees too. But they didn't. And they decided for the Cherokees. And it was all great until, Andrew Jackson ruined it. Well, in 1857, this case goes before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court gets to decide whether or not Dred Scott and his wife are going to be free. And this is how they ruled. They said that Black people were not citizens, that they could not sue in court, that they never should have been allowed to sue, that slaves were property, regardless of where they lived, and that Congress really didn't have the right to forbid slavery in the territories because it would deny people their right to own property. So this, of course, makes the Northerners really, really mad because they disagree with the decision. But the South is feeling very woohoo because they feel like this decision like vindicated them, that it supported their position regarding slavery. So Dred Scott v. Sandford is the name of the case if you want to look it up. There's, like I said, the video on the previous page that'll give you a little bit more information. All right, so all of this leads us to an election, a big pivotal election. Not that we know anything about big, hotly contested elections right now or anything, but the election of 1860 was definitely one of those. So a new slavery or a new anti-slavery party formed called the Republican Party. We had a new political party that was introduced on the scene, and their new candidate for president was Abraham Lincoln. Among other things, the Republicans were against slavery. They didn't want there to be any slavery in the new territories. They also wanted national banking, and they were in favor of protective tariffs. So I'm sure you can imagine that between this, no slavery in the territories, and this protective tariffs, that the South was like noping right out with the Republican Party. They were not interested in the Republican Party because of those two issues. So Abraham Lincoln becomes their first ever candidate for president. The Southerners are convinced that if Lincoln gets elected, that he's going to abolish slavery in all of the United States. So, like, they're totally anti-Lincoln. So the Democratic Party at this time basically splits, like the Democratic Party splits over the issue of slavery, and three candidates end up running against Lincoln. And so that essentially splits the votes in the southern states. Instead of them all voting for one guy, their vote gets split between three different people, and most of the North votes for Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln wins. He wins with the majority of the electoral votes, and not a single Southern state supported Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 election. So, not a single Southern state voted for Abraham Lincoln. Here's how the map plays out. Okay. So, Lincoln is in red. Okay. And you can see all the free states up here. All the free states voted for Lincoln. So did California. So did Oregon. Okay. And notice that the map also gives you the number of electoral college votes for each state. So now look down here. The Democratic Party had split into three parts. You had the Southern Democratic Party, you had the Constitutional Union Party, and then you had the Northern Democratic Party. And so basically, what ends up happening is that you've got enough states that vote for the Constitutional Union Party and the Northern Democratic Party that the Southern states end up getting split. Their vote gets split. Whereas all the free states voted for Abraham Lincoln, they voted together. All the slave owning states ended up splitting their votes among three other candidates. So Abraham Lincoln ends up winning 59% of the vote and 180 electoral votes. So in 1861, the Southern states start debating secession again, leaving the Union. And it's again because they think that Lincoln is going to end slavery in the United States. So in December of 1860, South Carolina votes to secede from the Union. So they went first. Um, Georgia was not the first state to go. In fact, in Georgia, there was still a big argument going on about not seceding. Alexander Stephens, who was a representative from the state of Georgia in the U.S. Congress, was against secession. He was anti-secession and wanted to keep Georgia from doing that. But Georgia ends up voting in January of 1861 to secede anyway, and 11 states eventually secede to form the Confederate States of America. And they elect Jefferson Davis to become their president. He becomes the president of the Confederacy. And then Alexander Stephens, again, who I said was from Georgia, ends up being elected vice president, which is kind of ironic since he was arguing against secession at the beginning, but he ends up seceding with Georgia after Georgia votes to secede and eventually becomes the vice president of the Confederacy. And if you click right here on this picture of him where he does not look tired and frustrated at all, that's totally sarcastic because he completely does. But if you click on that, there's a video there about Alexander Stevens. All right, so let's look at some more information. So this graphic shows you for each of the southern states the date when they seceded from the Union. And of course, it starts right here with South Carolina, and then several other states follow suit in January. It tells you how many slaves each of those states had and what percent of their population was made up of slaves. And then it also, and I thought this part was interesting, tells you how many slaveholders there were in that state, like the number of people according to the 1960 census or the 1860 census, the number of people who owned slaves or were slaveholders in the state, and that what percentage of the state's population owned slaves. Okay, so let's look at Georgia, for example. We seceded on January 18th of 1861. We had 4,000 or 462,198 slaves living in Georgia at that time, which was like roughly half of the state's population. That's 43.7%. So we're almost at 50% there. There were 41,084 slaveholders, and that was roughly 7% of Georgia's population that actually owned slaves. So it's interesting to see that only that 7% of the state owned almost half of the people that lived in the state. Okay. Now, look, here's something interesting to see. Look right here. So, we got all these people that seceded in January, and then Texas on February 1st. And then look, nobody else secedes until like April, May, and June of 1861. Anybody know why? Huh? Huh? It's because the war had started. It's because shots had been fired at Fort Sumter. And so these four states didn't secede until after the battles had actually started. And then they decided to secede as well. And then look, these states didn't secede. And we'll talk about why on this map. Okay. So take a look. All the dark blue states here, those are all free Union states. Okay. So these blue states and territories make up the Union. And then everybody in red, both colors, the light red and the dark red, those are all Confederate states. Okay. The reason these are colored like a little bit different than the others is because they didn't secede until after the war had already started. And then notice that Missouri and Kentucky and Delaware and Maryland, those are all in yellow. And that's because they were border states. They're called border states, and they were neutral, meaning they did not secede, but they did not formally become a fighting part of the Union. They wanted to stay out of the war and remain neutral. And then over here, these are all still territories. They're not officially states, and so therefore they're not officially part of the war. All right. Okay. The last thing that you need to do is complete show what you know. So read each one of these statements and then drag the tile over that matches that description. So long story long, I know, but that was a lot and it was kind of complicated. So thanks for sticking with me. Miss James's class, wake up, guys. The video's over. Always good to see you. And I will talk to you guys next week when we hit notes 2. Bye.